Shadows in Stonemaier. The sun hung low over Stonemaier, washing the cracked streets and weathered storefronts in a tired amber glow. The small city, once proud and industrious, had been eroded by years of quiet corruption, the kind that never announced itself in bold headlines, but instead seeped through the cracks of everyday life, like an invisible poison. Once, neighbors held block parties. Kids played tag in front yards until the streetlights flickered on. Now, doors locked at dusk, and silence reigned where laughter used to live. At the heart of Stonemaier stood the Stone County Courthouse, an old red brick building with weathered columns, and a clock tower whose hands had been stuck at 11:42 for over a decade. It was inside this building that 4 police officers, once hailed as local heroes, now strutted through the halls, basking in the glow of a courtroom victory that shouldn't have been possible. Captain Eli Granger, tall with a chest like a barrel and a smile that never quite reached his cold blue eyes, led the pack. His hand rested casually on his belt, fingers grazing the polished grip of his service weapon, a constant reminder to everyone around him that his authority was absolute. Behind him sauntered Lieutenant Dean Harkins, shorter and wiry, his perpetual smirk making him look like someone who enjoyed causing pain just for the sport of it. To Harkins, the law was a flexible thing, bent and reshaped to fit his needs, and those of the people who paid the highest. Sergeant Troy Delacroix was the quiet one, the brain behind their operation, the man who made evidence disappear, who rewrote timelines, and who knew just how to adjust a file to turn the guilty into the innocent. He carried a clipboard even in court, always the picture of professionalism, though the ink in his reports had long since been tainted. Then there was Officer Mallory Page, the newest and youngest of the 4, but no less corrupt. She had been recruited early, chosen not for her skills with a gun or badge, but for her charm. She could slip into conversations like a whisper, gathering intelligence, extracting confessions, and feeding them all back to Granger's inner circle. Together, these 4 officers had carved up Stonemaier like a prize hog. Drug money, protection rackets, under-the-table deals with shady developers. They dipped their hands into every pot, pocketing enough to buy lake houses, sports cars, and all the quiet power that came with knowing no one could touch them. The local district attorney, Julian Guillen, had tried. God knows she had tried to bring them down. But every time she built a case, evidence vanished. Witnesses disappeared or recanted. Anonymous threats found their way to her inbox. It was a rigged game, and Julia was running out of moves. That morning, the courtroom had been packed for the latest in a long string of hearings, a case against Captain Granger's unit for tampering with evidence in a fatal overdose investigation. The victim had been a teenager, just 16 years old, who had died with a lethal cocktail of heroin and fentanyl in his system. A small-time dealer had been arrested, but records showed the evidence logged at the scene had been mysteriously reduced, cash and drugs missing, and security footage erased. It should have been the case that finally broke the shield protecting the 4. It should have been the moment the city took back its conscience. Instead, after a brief recess, the judge declared the case dismissed. Insufficient evidence, chain of custody issues, a paperwork error, a familiar refrain. The 4 officers walked out of the courtroom like conquering heroes, laughing, exchanging backslaps, confident in their invincibility. Their lawyer, a slick city attorney imported from the state capital, promised celebratory drinks at a steakhouse where the cheapest entree cost more than most residents made in a week. They didn't see the woman sitting alone at the back of the courtroom, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look like much. Dark skin, a plain gray suit, hair pulled into a simple knot. Her expression was calm, almost detached, but her eyes followed every step the officers took. Her name was Jordan Wells, and while the people of Stonemaier knew her only as the new clerk assigned to the courthouse's record-keeping department, her real identity was something far more dangerous. She was Special Agent Jordan Wells of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and for the past 10 months, she had been living and breathing Stonemaier's corruption. embedding herself so deeply into the town's rhythms that even Captain Granger's spies hadn't noticed her presence. Jordan's journey to this moment had been long and brutal. From a tough childhood in Baltimore, where her mother cleaned houses and her father drove trucks, to the halls of Princeton, where she earned her law degree against all odds. Her passion for justice came not from textbooks, but from personal experience, from seeing how entire neighborhoods could be crushed by corruption when the system worked only for the powerful. Her assignment to Stonemaier hadn't been random. The FBI had been monitoring the town for years. The statistical spikes in unsolved cases, the patterns of officers buying property in cash, the suspicious disappearances of whistleblowers and witnesses. It was a cancer, hidden beneath the quaint surface of a small-town community, and Jordan had been handpicked to root it out. But there was a twist no one in the town could have predicted. 2 months before her arrival in Stonemaier, Jordan Wells had been quietly confirmed by the Senate to become the next director of the FBI, the youngest person and the first black woman to ever hold the post. Her appointment was classified until the day she would formally take office. In the meantime, she had asked for one final undercover assignment, to walk into Stonemaier, not as Director Wells, but as nobody. To gather evidence not from behind a polished desk in D.C., but from the heart of the rot itself. It was a gamble. If her identity were exposed, the fallout could jeopardize not only her own career but the Bureau's credibility. But Jordan had never been one to sit behind glass walls while others fought on the ground. Now, sitting in the courthouse, she watched Granger and his crew laugh and swagger their way into the parking lot, believing they'd beaten the system one more time. She smiled, the kind of smile you give when the game is almost over, and the pieces have finally moved into checkmate. Because what Granger didn't know was that Jordan wasn't just sitting on evidence. She had it all. The tapes, the bank transfers, the confidential informants ready to testify under federal protection. Every bribe, every missing bag of drugs, every threat, all meticulously logged, verified, and encrypted in a federal server. And tomorrow, she wouldn't just be introducing herself as an FBI agent. She would be sworn in as the new director of the FBI, and the first thing she would do in her official capacity was to personally oversee the arrests of Granger, Harkins, Delacroix, and Page, in front of every camera, every reporter, and every terrified citizen who had been too scared to speak out. Tomorrow, Stonemaier would wake up to a new reality. The shield of invincibility was gone, and for the first time in years, the people of Stonemaier might actually believe that justice had a voice. Jordan stood and adjusted her suit, her eyes never leaving Granger's back as he disappeared into his squad car. It was time. Cracks in the foundation. The next morning, the air in Stonemaier felt heavier than usual, though the town itself carried on like it always did, pretending not to notice the rot just beneath the surface. At Murphy's Diner, the local breakfast spot that had been serving pancakes and black coffee since the 1950s, a handful of regulars sat at the counter, nursing their morning mugs while the bell above the door jingled softly with every new arrival. Jordan Wells sat at a corner booth, back to the wall, her eyes flicking up every so often to scan the room. She had been part of the town's scenery long enough that people barely noticed her anymore. Just another courthouse clerk grabbing her morning coffee. That invisibility had been her greatest weapon. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, a text from a number only a handful of people had. Ready when you are. The team was in place. Federal agents from the Department of Justice's Public Corruption Task Force were already fanned out across town in unmarked vehicles, blending in with the morning traffic. They had warrants, arrest plans, and operational orders, all waiting for Jordan's signal. The arrests themselves would make headlines, but Jordan wanted more than that. She wanted to rip the mask off this whole operation in the most public, undeniable way possible, to make sure Stonemaier saw every filthy detail. No sealed indictments, no quiet transfers. She wanted Captain Eli Granger and his crew dragged into the light, kicking and screaming. Her coffee had gone cold by the time the front door jingled again, this time admitting Kevin Ortega, a local reporter who had been the town's only real voice of dissent. His articles, cautious, piecemeal, stitched together from reluctant sources, had painted the faintest outline of the corruption lurking in Stonemeyer's police department. But Kevin had never gotten close to the heart of it, not until Jordan came to town. Kevin slid into the booth across from her, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "They're still cops. People here, they might hate them, but they're terrified of what happens if they cross them." Jordan gave a slow nod. "That's the point. If we don't make this public, if we handle it behind closed doors, it'll be just another cover-up. Stonemeyer needs to see the truth with their own eyes." Kevin exhaled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Okay, when do we start?" Jordan glanced at her watch. 1 hour. Across town, Captain Granger stood in his office, leaning back in his leather chair, boot heels propped up on his desk. Sunlight cut across the room through half-closed blinds, slashing patterns across the faded carpet. Granger's office smelled of stale coffee, gun oil, and the faint metallic tang of fear, the kind of fear that clung to people who had stood too close to him for too long. Lieutenant Dean Harkins paced the room, agitated. "Something's off," he muttered, his words barely louder than the ticking wall clock. "That Nguyen woman's too quiet. And that clerk." He snapped his fingers, trying to recall Jordan's name. "Wells. She's been watching us." Granger snorted, dismissing the idea with a wave of his hand. "Clerk's harmless. Probably some over-educated paper pusher sent here to rot away. You're getting paranoid." "Am I?" Harkins stopped pacing, leaning both hands on Granger's desk. "We've skated through a dozen investigations, but this one felt different. The way they dug. The questions they asked. This was no local witch hunt." Granger's eyes narrowed slightly, but he covered it with a grin. "You worry too much. We won. Case dismissed. Same as always." But even as he said the words, Granger felt it. The hairline fracture in the foundation. The sense that their grip on Stonemere was slipping. Sergeant Troy Delacroix was already preparing an exit strategy. In a dimly lit backroom of a bar just outside town, he sifted through burner phones and fake IDs, lining them up with meticulous precision. His fingers shook slightly, not from fear, but from knowing the game was almost over. Delacroix had always been the brains. He knew every trick to bury evidence, every loophole in the legal code. But this time felt different. There were too many loose ends, too many whispers that someone was feeding information to the feds. He didn't trust Granger's bravado. Men like Granger thought they were untouchable until the cuffs snapped around their wrists. Delacroix had no intention of being there when it happened. He just needed a little more time. At the police station, Officer Mallory Page stood at her locker, staring blankly at her own reflection. Her badge sat on the metal shelf inside, gleaming in the fluorescent light. It had once meant something to her. Now it felt like a weight she couldn't carry much longer. She was in too deep to turn back. She knew that. But some nights, when the adrenaline wore off, and she was left with nothing but silence, she wondered how it had all gone so wrong. What had started as small favors for Granger, turning a blind eye, tweaking a report, had spiraled into something monstrous. She'd been complicit in things she couldn't even say out loud. The morning had started like any other, but her gut told her today would be different. 1 hour later, Jordan Wells stood on the courthouse steps. She had traded her plain gray suit for a crisp black one, tailored to perfection. The badge pinned to her lapel wasn't the plastic visitor pass she'd worn for months. It was her official FBI director's badge, gleaming under the sun. The gathered reporters murmured, cameras clicking as they took her in. Most of them had no idea who she was. That was about to change. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open, and a procession of federal agents emerged, each one carrying files, evidence boxes, and arrest warrants. Jordan stepped up to the podium, her calm, even voice cutting through the buzz of conversation. "My name is Jordan Wells," she began. "For the past 10 months, I've been working undercover here in Stonemaier. You've known me as a records clerk. In reality, I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd, but Jordan wasn't done. "As of today," she continued, "I have officially assumed the role of director of the FBI." The shock turned into stunned silence, punctuated only by the frantic typing of reporters scrambling to capture every word. "Over the last year, we have gathered irrefutable evidence of systemic corruption within the Stonemaier Police Department. This morning, federal warrants have been issued for the arrest of Captain Eli Granger, Lieutenant Dean Harkins, Sergeant Troy Delacroix, and Officer Mallory Page, on charges ranging from conspiracy and extortion to obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence." As she spoke, the cameras swung toward the police station, where federal agents were already swarming through the front doors. One by one, Granger's crew was led out in handcuffs, their faces pale, their arrogance replaced with stunned disbelief. Kevin Ortega stood at the front of the press pool, his hand shaking as he scribbled in his notebook. He had dreamed of this day, but he never imagined it would come like this. Jordan's voice carried over the chaos. "To the people of Stonemaier, this is not the end. This is the beginning of rebuilding trust, of reclaiming your town. Corruption only thrives in silence. Together, we break that silence." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, but then it grew, rising from the gathered crowd until it echoed off the courthouse walls. For the first time in years, Stonemaier had hope, and at the center of it all stood Jordan Wells. Not just an agent, not just a director, but a living, breathing reminder that no one was above the law. The ashes of power. The morning after the arrests felt unnaturally quiet, as though the very air in Stonemaier had been hollowed out. The infamous Stonemaier Four, Captain Eli Granger, Lieutenant Dean Harkins, Sergeant Troy Delacroix, and Officer Mallory Page, were no longer stalking the streets in their patrol cars, no longer leaning against brick walls with smug grins, no longer shaking down small business owners under the guise of safety checks. For the first time in years, there was no invisible net of fear over the town. But silence wasn't peace. It was the thin, fragile pause between demolition and reconstruction. The first cracks in loyalty. In a holding cell 3 towns over, Dean Harkins sat with his back pressed against the concrete wall, legs sprawled out in front of him. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, like an insect trapped inside his skull. His hands were still trembling. He had always believed in Granger, or at least in Granger's version of reality. They had built a machine together, one where everyone got paid and no one asked questions. The money was good. The power was better. But now Granger was sitting in his own cell, just down the hall, and the walls were closing in. A federal agent had already visited Harkins, offering a deal. Testify, flip on Granger and Delacroix, and maybe they'd shave off some time. Maybe. The old Harkins would have spat on the offer. But the old Harkins had never seen the inside of a federal holding cell before. He glanced at the steel table where the agent had left a manila folder. Inside were surveillance photos. Jordan Wells, sitting quietly in the corner of Murphy's Diner, walking the halls of the courthouse, exchanging hushed words with the district attorney Julian Guillen. The clerk, the invisible nobody, the director of the FBI. The insult of it burned more than the fear. They'd been played, outmaneuvered by a woman who had walked in smiling and unarmed and dismantled everything they built piece by piece. His stomach churned. When the agent returned, Harkins didn't spit. He didn't sneer. He said, "Let's talk." Mallory Page's reckoning. In another cell, Mallory Page sat on the edge of her metal cot, her knees drawn up to her chest, trembling hands folded between them. Her badge, confiscated upon arrest, had felt heavier than ever during the ride to the processing facility. Without it, she felt even smaller, like the scared rookie she had been when she first walked into the station. Her phone calls were limited. Her lawyer was a public defender who hadn't bothered to hide his distaste for her. Mallory had tried to call her sister, but the words caught in her throat when the automated voice asked her to state her name for the record. What was her name now? Mallory the cop. Mallory the enforcer. Mallory the traitor. She hadn't seen the recordings yet, but the lawyer's description had been enough. Wiretap audio, video surveillance, financial records, everything. Mallory knew how the game worked. She had helped build the game. She knew that if Granger went down, the feds would be coming for every enforcer, every bagman, every informant who had taken a dirty dollar. And she had taken plenty. Her only choices were to talk first or be buried with the rest. The town holds its breath. Back in Stonemaier, life didn't return to normal. It hesitated, like someone holding a door half open, not sure if they should step through or slam it shut. At Jackson Hardware, the old men who usually argued about football scores over morning coffee were silent. At Betty's Beauty Nook, the usual gossip about who was cheating with whom was replaced by whispered speculation about what would happen next. Was it over? Would the FBI leave? What if there were more? The fear wasn't gone. It had just changed shape. Because when a house falls, the foundation always cracks, and people wondered what else might come tumbling out. Jordan's private storm. Jordan sat alone in her temporary office, the old records room where she had spent months pretending to be someone she wasn't. The dusty shelves had been replaced with folding tables covered in documents, financial spreadsheets, surveillance logs, statements from terrified witnesses who had finally started to speak once the arrests were public. A mug of coffee sat beside her, untouched. Her phone, a secure federal line, vibrated softly. It was her deputy director in D.C. "Congratulations, Director Wells," the voice said. "The Bureau is impressed." Jordan's lips barely twitched. "Thanks. We'll send a transition team to help wrap up Stonemaier's oversight, but you'll need to return to Washington soon. There's a lot waiting for you." Washington, the shining halls of power. After everything she'd seen in Stonemaier, it felt a million miles away. "I'll leave when the job here's done," Jordan said softly. "Not before." There was a pause. "You sure that's smart?" "Smart's not the point." The call ended, leaving Jordan alone with her thoughts. The legacy of fear. On the surface, the Stonemaier Four were the biggest story in town. But the rot they left behind ran deeper than anyone could see. When Granger's patrol cars vanished, so did certain unmarked envelopes that used to appear at businesses every month. Safety fees, they were called, though everyone knew better. When Harkins was led away, certain favored dealers vanished into the night, their special protections gone. When Delacroix's name hit the news, so did whispers about the files he destroyed, the ones that could have freed innocent people sent to prison to protect Granger's allies. When Mallory Page's mugshot flashed across local news, mothers who once told their children to trust the police couldn't meet their own reflections in the mirror. Stonemaier wasn't just cleaning up corruption. It was facing the scars it had buried for years. The next wave. 2 days after the arrests, Jordan stood at the front of a packed town hall meeting. The old auditorium was overflowing, residents crammed into every available seat, lining the walls, standing in the back, craning their necks to see the woman who had undone the town's most powerful men. Julian Guyan stood beside her, the district attorney whose quiet persistence had kept the fight alive long enough for Jordan to break it wide open. Kevin Ortega sat near the front, notebook in hand, though this time his pen wasn't shaking. Jordan's voice was clear, but not cold. "I know you're scared," she said. "You've lived under a system that failed you for years. You were told there was no point in speaking up because no one would listen. That ends now. No applause. Just silence, the kind that's heavier than noise. I didn't come here to save Stonemaier. I came here because justice should never be a luxury. And it doesn't come from the outside. It comes from you." She scanned the crowd, locking eyes with people who had written anonymous letters, made secret calls, whispered warnings, They weren't invisible to her. Justice isn't just arresting a few dirty cops. It's changing the culture that let them thrive. It's demanding accountability, transparency, and knowing your voice matters. A man in the back raised his hand. His voice trembled. But what if they come back? Different faces, same power. Jordan didn't smile, but her voice carried something firm, something unbreakable. They only come back if you let them. Back in the cells, Eli Granger stared at the ceiling, his hands clasped behind his head. His empire was gone. His crew was flipping. His money trail was being traced. But all he could think about was the face of the quiet courthouse clerk he barely noticed. The woman who beat him. His smile was bitter. "She got me," he muttered. "Damn, she got me good." And for the first time in his life, Eli Granger had nothing left to say. A city with no shepherds. The sun set low behind the slate rooftops of Stonemaier, drenching the town in burnt orange light. But for the first time in years, there was no reassuring hum of patrol cars. No officers leaning against brick walls outside the courthouse. No heavy boots echoing through alleyways like threats. The Stonemaier Four were gone, hauled off in the back of unmarked federal vehicles, faces grim, hands cuffed, their years of power shattered in the span of a single day. But removing rot didn't mean the walls wouldn't cave in. Stonemaier was a city without shepherds. The power vacuum. Captain Eli Granger's arrest wasn't just a legal victory. It was a tectonic shift in the town's underbelly. Granger hadn't just controlled the Stonemaier Police Department. He had been the gatekeeper for every criminal operation that ran through the town. Drugs, protection rackets, backdoor property deals, it all flowed through him. And with Granger in custody, the dam broke. Every small-time hustler with a dream of empire came crawling out of the cracks. The first signs were subtle. Small convenience stores, once protected under Granger's watch, were hit by vandals who knew no backup was coming. A corner liquor store, one of Granger's regular contributors, was firebombed. No one hurt, but the message was clear. Stonemaier belonged to whoever grabbed it first. Without Granger's crooked cops acting as referees, a street war was brewing. The new faces of fear. In a windowless backroom at the edge of town, Mason Bricks Alvarez, a local enforcer too brutal even for Granger, held court. Bricks had once been frozen out, too unpredictable, too violent, even for the Stonemaier PD's corrupt standards. Now he saw opportunity. The same people who had feared Granger now feared Bricks. A man with no rules, no limits, and nothing to lose. He ran his hand down the worn handle of a sledgehammer leaning against the table, his signature weapon, as two nervous lieutenants updated him. Mallory's locked up, Granger's crews flipped. One said, "No one's protecting the businesses anymore." Bricks grinned, a smile with too many teeth, the kind of smile that turned stomachs. "Then it's our town now." Jordan's war shifts. Jordan Wells stood at the edge of a broken playground. The Federal Oversight Team's command post, temporarily set up inside the shuttered recreation center. The metal slide was rusted, the swings swayed in the breeze like empty nooses, and the merry-go-round was still splattered with old graffiti. Pigs run this town. She was no longer just undercover Agent Wells. She was Director Wells, and her presence alone was shifting the town's atmosphere. But Jordan knew the hard truth. Arresting corrupt cops didn't automatically rebuild trust. The community was caught between relief and fear, unsure whether to celebrate the fall of the Four or dread what would come next. She wasn't naive. Nature abhorred a vacuum, and Stonemaier's streets were already whispering about who might try to fill the void. Kevin Ortega, the only reporter willing to stand beside her during the entire ordeal, approached from the parking lot, notebook tucked under his arm. "More break-ins," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "A laundromat. 2 gas stations. People think the Four being gone means open season." Jordan sighed, crossing her arms. "I need you to help me." Kevin raised an eyebrow. "I thought the feds had it covered. I need the community to understand this isn't over." The bad cops are gone, but the bad actors filling the gap are worse. Kevin hesitated, then nodded. What do you need? Names, Jordan said. And stories. You've got contacts. We need to know who's already stepping into Granger's shoes. Kevin swallowed hard, glancing toward the playground where kids used to play before fear swallowed Stonemeyer whole. All right, he said, but you might not like what I find. The Ghost Files. The federal oversight team had set up temporary offices inside the old Stonemeyer Community Center, poring through case files, seized documents, and long-buried records dug up in Granger's private office. Jordan sat at a battered desk, papers spread around her like a storm. Financial logs, fake property transfers, evidence lockers where drugs disappeared and cash magically evaporated. One folder stood out. It was labeled Avery Langston. Jordan flipped it open, brow furrowing. Avery Langston was a former Stonemeyer officer, listed as retired under medical discharge 6 years ago. The records were vague. No details on the incident that led to the discharge, just boilerplate language about stress-induced breakdowns. But Avery's name showed up in unexpected places: old arrest logs, incident reports, even property sales connected to businesses that Granger's crew had later extorted. Avery hadn't disappeared. He had been cut loose. But why? Jordan made a note to dig deeper. Where there's smoke, there's usually a fire. Mallory's unexpected confession. Late that night, Jordan received a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Greaves, part of the federal prosecutorial team handling the Stonemeyer case. "You're not going to believe this," Greaves said. "Mallory Page just requested a meeting with you." Jordan paused, eyes narrowing. "What does she want?" "Not sure," Greaves said, "but she says she'll only talk to you." An hour later, Jordan stood in a small, windowless interview room at the federal holding facility, facing Mallory across a scratched metal table. Mallory's face was pale, her hands shaking slightly, cuffed in front of her. "I should hate you," Mallory said, her voice brittle. "But part of me's relieved." Jordan didn't reply. She waited. "You want names?" Mallory whispered. "I'll give you names, but not Granger's crew. They're old news." Jordan leaned forward slightly. "Then who?" Mallory swallowed hard. "The people above Granger. The ones who let it all happen. City council members, developers, state police liaisons, even a few federal agents who looked the other way." Jordan's stomach turned, though her expression stayed neutral. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm done being a pawn," Mallory said. "And because if I go down, they all should." Jordan nodded slowly. "You'll have to testify. Publicly." Mallory's eyes flickered with fear, but she nodded. "Deal," she whispered. The higher web. Stonemeyer's corruption wasn't just a local disease. It was a network, a web of influence that stretched far beyond one crooked captain and his enforcers. Mallory's confession opened the floodgates. Jordan spent the next 48 hours reviewing her statements, tracing money trails that led into state development funds, grants meant for revitalizing low-income areas, and corporate shell companies that had swallowed up properties through sham sales. It wasn't just about Stonemeyer's police. It was about politicians who sold the town's future to line their own pockets, and law enforcement agencies who let it happen for a piece of the pie. The arrests of the Stonemeyer Four had been the first domino. But Jordan had just found the rest of the row. A warning in the dark. The night after Mallory's confession, Jordan returned to her temporary apartment, the one the FBI had set up just outside town limits. She was bone-tired, her mind a blur of names, schemes, and betrayals. As she reached her door, she spotted it. A bullet, resting on the welcome mat. No note, no message, just a bullet. Jordan knelt, picking it up between her fingers. It was clean, polished, not a threat, but a promise. The network she had uncovered wasn't just going to let her walk away. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The wolves at the door. The bullet on Jordan Wells' doorstep sat in her open palm, gleaming softly under the dim porch light. It was a 308 rifle round, clean and unmarked, the kind favored by snipers and professional enforcers. It wasn't the calling card of a street thug or a panicked local. This was a message from professionals. The air was still, the quiet kind that comes before a thunderstorm. Only the storm was already here, swirling invisibly around her, and Jordan could almost hear it whispering in the dark. She took a slow breath, stepped inside her temporary apartment, and locked the door behind her. The bullet went into her pocket, but the weight of it followed her everywhere she moved. The reach of the invisible hand. What Mallory Page had revealed, the names, the shadow network controlling Stonemaier, was bad enough. But Jordan's deeper investigation over the last 48 hours had taken her into even darker territory. Shell companies linked to municipal construction contracts tied back to holding firms in Miami, Denver, and Baltimore. Firms that didn't seem to have actual offices, only P.O. boxes and legal representatives with histories of corporate fraud. These companies were laundering federal funds meant for community revitalization grants, using Stonemaier's police force to intimidate locals into selling properties at a fraction of their value. The corrupt cops were tools, but the real power was higher up, a hidden cabal of developers, political lobbyists, and state officials who had been gutting towns like Stonemaier across 3 states for nearly a decade. Jordan cross-referenced every name Mallory gave her with federal records. What she found was chilling. Judges, state senators, and even 2 current FBI field supervisors had received donations, kickbacks, or undisclosed real estate investments linked to the same shadow network. This wasn't just about Stonemaier. It was a regional operation, and Jordan had put herself right in the center of their spotlight. The sudden silence. Jordan's phone had been active for days. Updates from the oversight team, constant emails from DOJ prosecutors, inquiries from media outlets across the country. But after the bullet showed up, her phone went oddly quiet. Too quiet. She tried calling Assistant U.S. Attorney Martin Greaves, the lead prosecutor on the case. Voicemail. She tried her federal oversight lead, Agent Carla Reynolds. Voicemail. Even her deputy director back in Washington didn't answer. Something was wrong. Jordan locked her phone, slipped it into her pocket, and grabbed her go-bag, a plain black duffel she always kept ready. Inside were a burner phone, her sidearm, extra ammo, and an encrypted USB drive containing every document, recording, and name she had gathered. She didn't wait. She didn't call for backup. The walls were closing in. A meeting with the last honest man. There was only one person she knew she could find. Kevin Ortega. The reporter had been the first to risk his life exposing Stonemaier's rot, long before the feds took interest. If anyone had a pulse on what was happening in the shadows, it was him. Jordan found him at Ollie's, a rundown bar on the outskirts of town where the jukebox hadn't worked in years and the neon sign buzzed louder than the patrons. Kevin sat in the corner booth, eyes darting nervously between the door and his glass of water. No alcohol, not tonight. When Jordan slid into the booth across from him, Kevin didn't bother with pleasantries. "They're disappearing," he said quietly. "The whistleblowers, the informants, 2 of my sources, gone. Their phones disconnected, their apartments cleaned out." Jordan's stomach tightened. Since when? Since yesterday. The same day the bullet appeared. Kevin slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Jordan opened it and found a list of names, not just locals, but state investigators, attorneys, even low-level auditors who had either vanished or gone dark in the past 48 hours. "This isn't just a local thing," Kevin whispered. "These people, they've got reach." Jordan already knew, but hearing it confirmed, seeing it laid out in ink, made it feel heavier. "What about Greaves?" Jordan asked. Kevin shook his head. No sign of him since this morning. The trap closes. As Jordan drove back toward her apartment, her headlights washed over the same black SUV parked a block away. The same vehicle that had followed her the day after the arrests. This time, It was empty. Jordan parked one street over and cut the engine. She reached into her go-bag, pulling out her sidearm and clipping it to her belt, before palming the burner phone. She walked the long way, through back alleys and between vacant lots, her heart pounding with each step. The night air was thick, humid, the kind that made it hard to breathe. When she reached her building's back entrance, the door was ajar. Inside, her apartment had been ransacked, papers scattered, furniture overturned, her laptop screen shattered. But the USB drive was still tucked into her pocket. They had been looking for something. They hadn't found it. Her phone buzzed again. Blocked number. She answered, saying nothing. "Walk away, Director. Go back to DC before you disappear too." The voice was disguise, run through a digital filter, but the intent was clear. Jordan didn't reply. She hung up, slipped her phone into her pocket, and took one last look at the wreckage of her temporary life. She wasn't walking away. The Council of Ghosts. Jordan didn't go to the oversight office. It was compromised. She knew that now. Instead, she drove to an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles outside town, a location only she, Kevin, and Julian Nguyen knew about. Julia, the local district attorney, was already there, pacing in the moonlight. "They're moving faster than we thought," Julia said, her voice low and tight. "2 of my assistants have already been pulled off the case by higher authority. One of my subpoenas was quashed by a federal judge." Jordan exhaled slowly. "They're cutting off the investigation at every level." Julia nodded grimly. "They don't want to just bury it. They'd want to erase it." Jordan pulled out the USB drive and held it up. "They can't erase what's already out there." Julia's eyes widened. "You gave copies to someone." Jordan shook her head. "Not yet, but I'm about to." The nuclear option. Jordan had spent years preparing for cases like this. Deep corruption, layered protection, enemies hiding in plain sight. She knew that sometimes the only way to survive was to make sure the truth was so visible no one could kill it. She logged into a secure server through her burner phone, uploading every document, recording, and confession. Then she sent one email, blind copy to every major investigative journalist in the country, including whistleblower organizations and civil rights groups. Subject: Evidence Dump, Stonemaier, and Beyond. The email body was brief. Attached is evidence of systemic corruption spanning local law enforcement, state officials, and federal agents. This is not just a Stonemaier problem. It is a cancer spreading through our institutions. The people deserve to know. Jordan Wells, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She hit send. And just like that, the truth belonged to everyone. The final call. Her phone rang again. Blocked number. This time she answered. "You just signed your own death warrant," the distorted voice growled. Jordan's grip tightened around the phone, but her voice was calm. "No," she said quietly. "I just made sure you can't kill the truth." A long silence followed. Then the line went dead. What's left to burn? As dawn broke over Stonemaier, the first headlines appeared online. Corruption network tied to law enforcement, state officials, and real estate developers uncovered in FBI leak. The storm was no longer just Jordan's to carry. It belonged to the world. And Stonemaier, for better or worse, was now ground zero for the reckoning to come. Fire and rebirth. The world knew now. Within 12 hours of Jordan Wells' evidence dump, the story of Stonemaier's corruption network had spread across every major news outlet in the country. Anchors spoke in grave tones about small-town betrayal turned national scandal, while pundits debated how high the rot really went. Some called it a failure of oversight. Others, a failure of courage. For Jordan Wells, it was a victory bought in blood and sleepless nights. But the war wasn't over. The vanishing lines of loyalty. By the time the sun rose, half the named officials in Mallory Page's confession had gone dark. Phones disconnected, bank accounts drained, homes abandoned. The same people who had built their careers on control and silence were scattering like cockroaches exposed to the light. Jordan stood on the balcony of the Federal Oversight Team's temporary command post, a second cup of coffee cooling in her hands. Sleep had been out of reach for days, her mind running in endless loops. Who could still be trusted? Who was about to betray her? And how long until the next bullet wasn't just a warning? The town below her seemed caught in a similar limbo, its residents unsure whether they were witnessing a liberation or the start of something worse. The Stonemaier Police Department had been effectively dissolved, its remaining officers placed under federal review, but removing a system didn't automatically rebuild trust. People locked their doors, peered through curtains, and waited to see who would come for them next. The first casualty. The text came just after noon. Kevin Ortega found dead. Apparent suicide. Jordan's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the metal balcony floor. Kevin, the only reporter who had stood with her from the beginning. The man who had risked everything, even when no one else believed the truth was worth the fight. She felt the cold wind cut through her suit jacket, but it couldn't touch the fire spreading in her chest. She was done playing defense. The meeting in the ruins. That night, Jordan didn't stay at the oversight office. She drove instead to the ruins of the Stonemaier Steelworks, the abandoned factory that had once been the town's beating heart before corrupt developers gutted it for scrap and real estate tax breaks. She parked near a broken chain-link gate, the rusted metal sagging like tired shoulders. A figure waited near the skeletal remains of the loading dock. It was Avery Langston, the former Stonemaier officer whose name had surfaced in the ghost files. Discharged under murky circumstances, Avery had disappeared from public view, but he hadn't left Stonemaier. He had just gone underground. "You made a lot of noise, Director," Avery said, his voice roughened by years of anger and cigarette smoke, enough to stir up all the wrong people. "Good," Jordan replied. "They deserve to be scared." Avery lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Kevin was one of the good ones. I fed him what I could, but they were always a step ahead." Jordan's fists clenched at her sides. "Who killed him?" Avery exhaled a long, ragged breath. It wasn't just one of Granger's goons. It was the people above him. The ones who paid Granger to keep Stonemaier under control. "Kevin's death wasn't personal. It was a message to you." Jordan's jaw tightened. Message received. The network fights back. The next 48 hours were a blur of retaliation. Witnesses who had come forward were threatened or silenced. Federal agents assigned to process seized documents found their families' private information leaked online. Addresses, children's schools, even medical records. A chilling statement was posted anonymously on dark web forums known for trafficking intimidation contracts. The director falls next. But Jordan Wells had faced worse. She called a press conference on the steps of the ruined police station. Cameras lined up, reporters' faces tense with anticipation. She stood behind a bulletproof podium, a visible reminder of the threats hanging over her, but her voice was clear. To the people of Stonemaier, and to anyone watching across this country, let me be very clear. You cannot kill the truth. You cannot threaten it into silence. You cannot buy enough bullets to bury it forever. She let the silence stretch, her gaze meeting every camera lens head-on. If I fall, someone else will stand. If they fall, someone else will rise. This is not just about Stonemaier. This is about every place where power has been corrupted, where justice has been sold to the highest bidder. Her voice never wavered. And to those responsible, I see you. You can hide your faces, your names, your bank accounts, but I see you, and I'm coming. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in fear, but the message was sent. Jordan Wells was done hiding. Betrayal in the ranks. That night, her deputy director from Washington finally returned her call. "You made yourself a target," the voice said, cold and clipped. "This is not how the Bureau handles corruption." "This is exactly how we handle it," Jordan shot back. You just got too comfortable playing along. The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. Someone in her own agency had been complicit. Whether for money, power, or fear, it didn't matter. The infection reached all the way to Washington. She hung up without saying goodbye. The last firefight. The attack came just after midnight. Jordan was reviewing affidavits in her temporary safe house when she heard the first shattering window. Glass sprayed across the floor as two figures in tactical gear burst through the front door, weapons raised. They expected her to run. She didn't. Jordan dove behind the couch, drawing her sidearm in one fluid motion, returning fire. The close quarters exchange was deafening, gunshots echoing off plaster and drywall as splinters filled the air. She hit the first man in the knee, dropping him with a scream. The second man ducked behind the doorframe. And that's when the federal backup Jordan had quietly called earlier arrived. Lights flooded the street. Tactical agents swarmed the house, overwhelming the would-be assassins in seconds. When the dust settled, Jordan stood over the two intruders, her breath ragged but steady. One of them wore a state police badge, the other, a federal badge. The final strike. By dawn, Jordan had enough evidence, combined with Mallory's confessions, Kevin's files, and her own investigation, to trigger a coordinated federal raid across 3 states. Properties tied to the Shadow Network were seized, accounts frozen. High-ranking officials, some of them wearing statehouse pins, others carrying FBI credentials, were led out in cuffs. It wasn't just Stonemeyer's reckoning. It was a national earthquake. The burial and the rebirth. Kevin Ortega's funeral was held under gray skies in a field outside Stonemeyer. Jordan stood at the back, her hands clasped, her badge hidden beneath her coat. When the priest asked if anyone wanted to speak, Jordan stepped forward. She didn't talk about Kevin's death. She talked about his life, the kind of courage it takes to speak when no one's listening, to write when no one's reading, to fight when no one believes. When she finished, there were no dry eyes, not even her own. Director Wells moves forward. A week later, Jordan Wells stood at a different podium, this time inside the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, facing a room full of reporters, senators, and fellow agents. Her voice was calm, but steel-lined. "The story of Stonemeyer isn't unique," she said. "It's a story playing out in small towns and big cities across this country, where power is abused, where justice is bought and sold, and where silence becomes the deadliest weapon." She looked out over the room. The difference is, in Stonemeyer, the silence is over. The applause was thunderous. Epilogue. The first step. Back in Stonemeyer, kids played in the once-abandoned playground. The police department was being rebuilt, with civilian oversight. Residents showed up at town hall meetings, not in fear, but to demand transparency. And Jordan Wells. She kept one bullet from her doorstep in a frame on her desk in D.C. A reminder. You cannot kill the truth.